Hello and welcome to the 2.1 cast. I'm your host Neil Murray and I'm joined this week by Euan Robertson. Euan, how are you doing?
I'm very well, Neil, and yourself?
Yeah, good, thanks. It's nice to have you on. And Stefan, how are you doing?
I'm doing very well, mate. It's very well indeed.
Excellent. Well, we're speaking after Scotland versus the Faroe Islands, so we've finally got a win in this World Cup qualifying campaign, which is great. I think we're all feeling a bit bummed out after Israel on Sunday, but we do have a win on the board now. Maybe kind of mixed feelings after this kind of opening international week in those three games. We have 5 points from 9 available. Stefan, if there was a report card for Steve Clarke after these three games, what letter grade are you giving him?
I'm probably going to say about a C plus. We'll maybe get into more details, later in the podcast, but I haven't been blown away by the performances or the results in these games. Obviously we end on a high with a big result against Faroe Islands, but I tend to look at these games against the minnows with all due respect. I kind of take the bad and good results against these teams with a pinch of salt, because at the end of the day, they're not really great indicators of how well the team are playing on the whole. It certainly doesn't make up for a poor performance against Israel. But I thought, a point against Austria to kick off this international week was fine. So, we finished these round of qualifiers in second place, I'm certainly not calling for Steve Clarke's head or anything like that, but I just think Scotland could have been a lot better over the course of the three games. I haven't been wholly impressed, to be perfectly honest with you.
Yeah, I know after we obviously did a post-match reaction after last Thursday's game against Austria, and I think we were relatively positive. I mean, I think going into that game, most of us would perhaps taken a 2-2 draw or a draw against Austria. I think we talked about on that podcast how when you actually look at that game and how good or bad Austria were, you kind of maybe look back on it and think, really, should we have managed to get 3 points, and the goals we lost were a bit soft? But Euan, I don't know what you think, if you agree with Stefan. Surely the biggest disappointment, and it was the biggest game out of the three, was the Israel game. I mean, we were all making jokes on that extra podcast about how we were dreading it, and it unfortunately turned out rather predictably.
Yeah, this three games in the World Cup qualifiers kind of feels like a missed opportunity. In my eyes, especially that Israel game, I completely agree with what Stefan said. I think that a draw against Austria wasn't a terrible result. I think how we view that result was kind of determined on what happened against Israel, and ultimately we failed to win. An optimist will probably look at it and say, look, we're unbeaten in 3 games, we sit second in the group in the playoff position, so it's not really bad, but you've got to consider we have played the Faroe Islands, and I think that Israel result might come back to haunt us yet again. And I just think that there's been positives from this campaign. These 3 games, we're probably going to talk about it, but there's certainly been negatives as well. And I think that maybe how we approached both the Israel and Austria game was perhaps a little bit negative. Now, I don't know if that's overly surprising, considering various factors, but it just feels like we didn't get as much out of these 3 games that we might need to qualify for the World Cup. And I'm a huge fan of playing a back 3 or a back 5, however you look at it, and I think these games should have been used to get players familiarise each other with themselves in the formation, build up relationships between centre backs and full backs and centre backs and midfielders and stuff like that. And I don't know if we've really got that. And the other thing I'd probably be a little bit disappointed in is I think we could have used these 3 games to maybe look at players who could come into the squad for the summer. I know Steve Clarke's very loyal, but how many minutes has Liam Palmer got this campaign? 10. John Flex, I think, is the same. So could we have looked at a Billy Gilmore? I know he's not playing football, but neither's David Marshall, neither's Declan Gallagher. So I just feel like it's a bit of a missed opportunity this campaign.
Mm-hmm. I mean, you covered a couple of points there, Euan. Stefan, let's start. We're going to start with maybe what hasn't worked and look at the negatives, I suppose. I'm thinking, or if we do that, we'll end on a nice positive note when we finish up. But let's kind of touch on, first of all, what you spoke about there, Euan. I mean, for me, I think you're right. In terms of missed opportunities, I still don't think we know the best back 3 or 5, but particularly the best back 3. I know you can maybe argue that Tierney's definitely part of that. and then you really need to look at, would a fully fit Declan Gallagher come back in, or is Hanley and Hendry the kind of preferred duo beside Tierney? Or again, obviously tonight against the Faroes, McTominay went back in there. So I don't know, Stefan, do you think any of those kind of back threes have worked for you and would be your first choice going into those Euro games, or do you think we're yet to find what our best lineup is in those three positions?
Yeah, I think the kind of back line is something that's kind of puzzled me over the course of these three games. I thought Kieran Tierney's been outstanding at centre back again. I mean, I thought he was head and shoulders our best player over the course of the three matches, to be honest with you. But I thought the way that Clark's kind of fiddled around with his back line has actually kind of led to quite a lot of puzzle. It led me to a lot of confusion, to be perfectly honest with you. I was quite surprised to see Hanley starting against Austria. I thought Hendry as well was similar. I thought, even though he obviously took Hendry off, sorry, that was an Israel game. Even despite that, I actually thought Hendry's done relatively fine, considering he's kind of been thrown into this team. Obviously, hasn't got a huge amount of experience at international level. Hanley's kind of came back as a player who, although a lot of Scotland fans don't rate him, he's still got a lot of experience for Scotland. So he's maybe not so much he's not nearly as much of a novice at this level as Hendry was. So I kind of was willing to give Hendry a benefit of the doubt for the most part. And to be honest with you, I thought he did all right in both games. I know he got taken off against Israel, but I think that was more of a tactical switch rather than Clark suggesting that Hendry wasn't up to task. In contrast, I thought Hanley hasn't really done much for me over the course of these three games, suggest that he's improved dramatically as a player. I mean, I know he does a great job for Norwich, and Norwich are now knocking on the door for the Premier League, but for example, I kind of felt like, maybe Clark kind of drafted him in for that Austria game to deal with Kladzic up front, because he's just this kind of towering target man, and he ends up scoring 2 goals, I think, both headers or whatever else, and one poacher's goal, whatever you want to call it. So that kind of tactical switch didn't work at all. I thought Scotland also looked a little less composed in the ball without McTominay in defence, to be perfectly honest with you, in both the Austria and the Israel games. So, it's just, that's the kind of main thing that's kind of stood out to me as quite surprising, to be honest. I kind of wrote a piece for the website during the week looking at specifically the Israel game, and I think my main issue with, how this international break has gone is obviously, the fact that we dropped 2 points against Israel, but I think that's also largely down to the fact that Clark was unable to kind of push the boat out and really go for that game. It was the same old mistakes we've seen against Israel, 4 times in the last 12 months. We stood off them, we made them look much better than they are, and rather than Clark trying to come up with some sort of bespoke tactic or formation to really beat Israel, he kind of relied on his back five that is going to obviously be his kind of template going forward, and that's what kind of bothered me. That's that's probably my main negative takeaway from this. The fact that Clark had a great opportunity to kind of show how different and how pragmatic he can be as a tactician, but we didn't really get to see that, and he kind of played into a lot of the kind of stereotypes and the criticisms that I think a lot of people who aren't as enamoured by him as a coach feared when he got the Scotland job. I'm not particularly in that camp, and as I said at the top of the show, I'm not really calling for him to get sacked or anything by those means, but I was disappointed that he didn't look at that Israel game and think, I can move this around, I can make it a back four, we can stick another striker in, we can try and do something to really put the pressure on Israel, and he didn't do that. So it kind of made me fear maybe we've kind of sitting here with a one-trick pony on the sidelines. Now that formation might work well against Serbia, it might work well when we eventually play Denmark and have to travel out to Austria, but as we've seen with Scotland time and time again in these qualifying games, we can usually step up against the big teams, but it's the Israel's away and things like that which end up costing us a qualification. And I fear if Clark is unwilling to step away from this kind of reserved, safe tactic, then we might end up dropping more points on the road.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what you think. I mean, I think he did slightly change to like a 4-2-3-1 against Israel in that second half, but I still think regardless of that, I think it was maybe you made the point, Stefan, on Twitter. It's that thing where how many games has he now had against Israel and he's not been able to actually come up with a tactical plan to beat a team. Essentially, that's the team in the group he's been employed to beat. I mean, it's the teams we've always struggled, those middle teams, not the top teams. And I think that's what's so disappointing for me. As you say, even if he is a one-trick pony, I just think, why hasn't he been able to work that out? Like, we do have better players than Israel. We've played them enough times now to know what they're good at and what we have to stop, and we've just not done it. And I guess Euan, just kind of touching on that, I mean, in staying with the back line, you obviously cover Motherwell and Hamilton for Lanarkshire Live. Looking at Hanley there, like Stefan saying, I think he's solid enough, he's good in the air, he's that defender that's going to be in the middle of the three. Do you think he's a better option than Declan Gallagher? No, Declan Gallagher's not been playing, but if he was fit, would you still go back to a Declan Gallagher? And I guess just kind of moving on the conversation with the back line, the other point relating to that is Andy Robertson. I know Andrew Southwick wrote a piece today on our site about whether it's time to drop him, but is there an argument, I know it's the Faroes, but instead of saying, Tierney should play there instead, this kind of setup gives Tierney that kind of room to run into. He's going to be forward regardless of where he plays, and maybe it is the changes in the system when you compare Scotland and Liverpool are to not to blame, but that's why we're not getting the same Andy Robertson from club level. Or am I being far too generous to him?
Yeah, I don't think Andy Robertson should be dropped at all. I read Andrew's piece and I enjoyed it, but he's not going to get dropped, so there's no point talking about that, because he's simply not going to get dropped and he shouldn't get dropped. It's about getting the best out of him and Kieran Tierney. I firmly believe that they both need to play, and the way to utilise them the most efficiently is to play a 5-3-2. It's a formation that I think that Scotland are best suited to. I'm a massive fanboy of Scott McTominay, and I believe that, I watch a lot of Manchester United. He does play a sort of double pivot next to Fred behind Bruno in midfield, but he does have a licence to go forward. If he goes forward, Fred kind of sits and vice versa. But I actually think for Scotland, he's much better as a right centre back. I think he's the only player who can really play there. I think Jack Hendry would be the backup option, and like Stefan said, he didn't disgrace himself at all. I think it was good that Steve Clarke had a look at him, and I was quite surprised he entrusted him to start the first two games. But you look at it and, is he as good as McTominay there? He's not. McTominay's better at progressing the ball. I thought Hendry looked a little bit tentative at times in that aspect, and I think McTominay plays a good balance. So if you've got McTominay your right centre back, Kieran Tierney your left centre back, Andy Robertson's going to be your left wing back, and it's probably going to be Stephen O'Donnell that right wing back option. I know Ryan Fraser played there. I think James Forrest could possibly be another option there, but the question mark is over who plays in the centre of that back three. I think your three options are probably Declan Gallagher, Liam Cooper and Grant Hanley. I don't think Grant Hanley done anything disgracefully bad in the game. He obviously scored a really important goal. He's playing consistently and well for a Norwich side who are flying in the Championship. So you've credit where credit's due. Sometimes it gets a really hard reputation, in my opinion anyway. But going back to your original point regarding Declan Gallagher, Declan's not played too much recently. He's came back from injury and he's not got back into the side because the two players, Ricky Lamy and Tyler Maglor, who were playing there, were doing pretty well, and Graham Alexander kept the faith with them, which is completely understandable. I expect Declan Gallagher to now play for the remainder of the season, and I think that his performances previously for Scotland, much like his teammate Stephen O'Donnell, have been pretty good in general, and I think it's a little bit harsh for him not to have played at all in these games, because ultimately it's not his fault that he got injured. Players get injuries, players pick up injuries. I know he's not been playing, but I would have liked to see Gallagher play tonight, for example. I don't know if he's maybe got a niggle or there's something going on there, because if McTominay, Gallagher and Tierney looked pretty good in my eyes, so I don't really see the need to change it, and especially not to maybe give him another opportunity to impress tonight. I thought it was a little bit strange.
Yeah, Stefan, I don't want to dwell too much more on the back line because we've got quite a bit to cover, but McTominay, I suppose this is more like a midfield point. I get what you're saying, and I agree. I think we've kind of covered in a bit of depth on this podcast the strengths McTominay brings by playing at that in the back three. Obviously, has very good passing abilities, technically very good. He can step out. He is very comfortable with the ball at his feet. But do we miss him in the midfield, Stefan? I mean, and I guess just in general, like looking at the midfield, what has and hasn't worked for you over these 3 games? I mean, I think it's easy enough to say Ryan Jack's been a miss really in terms of how it's balanced, but is there anything else that Clark's maybe done or not done that you think really sticks out? I mean, for me, I think I know it's funny saying this because McGinn's obviously scored 3 goals in the 3 games, but again, I think he still could be pushed further forward in some parts of matches.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question, because I think the midfield's kind of overlooked almost in this tactic by Steve Clark. Obviously there's a huge emphasis on the back line, the back 3, the wing backs, whether they work or not, and then there's obviously a huge emphasis on that kind of player, the Ryan Fraser, or tonight Lyndon Dykes or whoever else playing off the main striker. But the central midfielders are kind of just overlooked in this formation, and I think it kind of shows, to be perfectly honest with you. I thought McTominay looked much better in defence than he has in midfield. I thought McGregor, despite the confident win against Faroe Islands, I thought he was a complete passenger. I thought Kenny McLean was more or less a complete passenger as well. And I thought the kind of midfield we put together against Israel and Austria was kind of similar, to be perfectly honest with you. McGinn did work when he's allowed to kind of play further forward, so you can almost kind of take him out of the midfield question because he's playing almost the number 10 or off the striker himself. So if the honest answer is we don't actually have a functioning central midfield at the moment, from these 3 games anyway, I personally, and I've kind of been tooting his horn for a couple of months now, maybe last year or so for Scotland, and I think we do miss a player like Ryan Jack, who just seems to not just sit but also kind of get stuck in, because you can have anyone sit, you can have McLean or McGregor sit, but they don't really seem to do a huge amount. Jack seems to do a lot more for me on the ball for Scotland. And I also think maybe the calls for Billy Gilmore, I think you mentioned him earlier in the podcast as well. I think in the real world, I don't think Clark's going to pick him unless he's picking up game time for Chelsea, which is, you can argue whether that's right or wrong, but it strikes me that a Gilmore or a Jack or someone, we are kind of missing that pitch, because we kind of basically gave up the midfield. We certainly did in the Israel game. Austria game was back and forth, and even in the Faroe Islands game for the first half, they had kind of domination in the middle of the park, which just really shouldn't be happening at all. So that is a problem area for me in terms of the tactics, and I think it's not really going to fix itself unless we can find the right personnel to go in there. I prefer McTominay at centre-back, to be honest with you, so I would rather see a Jack or even a Gilmore kind of given a shot before the Euros, or maybe even, I don't think Gilmore's obviously going to be starting the Euros, but I think it's a problem area that we need to find someone else to slot in there.
Obviously the worry for Jack is he has been quite injury prone this season, but again, I wonder if that also ties into the fact that, and we've all talked about this and we covered it in the last podcast after the Austria game, but it happened again tonight, even in the Faroes, and it happened on Sunday as well. I mean, nearly all the goals or the main chances we've conceded or let up have been coming from us not closing down a cross or not putting pressure on the ball for a shot, and you wonder if someone like Ryan Jack maybe would be better in there. We're maybe missing that one player that's just can cut out a pass, and I'm not saying that is what Ryan Jack does all the time, but I think we're definitely missing something. And I also think, maybe, to be honest, that's a bit idealistic of me. I think that is just a bit of how Steve Clark's teams seem to play, like kind of ride your luck, and as long as if you let these shots happen, like most of the time they're not going to go in, you're just kind of, I don't know, I just feel like maybe that's what we're just going to have to get used to by the looks of things, because it's essentially just limit the teams to speculative efforts and hope for the best, and it's kind of not really worked that way, and I guess we can maybe reflect on the goalkeeper there, but we'll stick with the midfield, Euan, for the time being. Is again kind of similar to what I was saying with the defence, that we probably haven't actually found what that best midfield is. We don't know whether McTominay in Clark's eyes is a defender or a midfielder at the moment. We obviously do miss Ryan Jack. You mentioned Billy Gilmore before. We tried Armstrong in the first game. We don't know exactly where to play McGinn. McGregor's been in and out these last 3 games. Are you kind of confident in your head what you would play as that starting midfield, or are we still kind of tinkering to find what is most effective, really?
Yeah, it really depends. I do think that Ryan Jack's profile's probably been raised during this period, because I think we've probably missed him, especially in the kind of bigger games. He does a lot of good work, like he does for Rangers. He's quite a disciplined midfielder. I think his game management's really good. He's quite tenacious. He's good at playing just like 1-2 touch, like he often does at Rangers, and like kind of triangles with Davis and Kamara. But like you said, Neil, I think there's a real question mark over his injury record this season. He's been injured quite a lot of times, and I think that's a real concern. But to me, I'd think that depending on how Scotland play, that McGregor and Jack would probably be the best two, and that kind of double pivot that Clark seems to play. I think it also depends on what's he going to do further up the pitch. Is he going to play two central strikers, or is he going to play one striker with kind of two attacking mids off, which I imagine he would do. And then for those positions, it looks like McGinn and Fraser are probably nailed on to play behind the central striker, whether that be Lyndon Dykes or Shea Adams. The Billy Gilmore one's just really interesting for me. I know he's not been playing regular football, but he's such a talent, and I'd have had him in the squad. I think Flex barely had any minutes. We know what McLean can do. I'm not saying have him in that squad would have meant he's going to the Euros, but you could have had a look at him, started him tonight, seen how he was, and got a real feel for the player. But I just think it was a real missed opportunity with Gilmore, because to me he's a player who could play there. He's a little bit different, he's right-footed. I think Fleck, McGregor and McLean are all left-footed. And I'm kind of weird. I do like that balance in my team between right and left-footed players, and I think he's the one that feels like kind of got away a little bit ahead of the Euros, but he's not going to play for Chelsea regularly over the end of the season. They've got Jorginho, Kovacic and Kante, all top-class players that are ahead of him, so unless one of them gets injured, I can't see him getting regular minutes, and if he's not getting regular minutes, he's just not going to get in the Scotland squad.
Yeah, Stefan, let's look at something a bit more positive now, because I think all of these are fair points, but we did promise some positivity. I think John McGinn is an obvious one. It's some scoring record he's got. Was it 10 goals in 32 games or something like that for Scotland? For midfielder is excellent. I think another massive bright spark has been Ryan Fraser. That's now 3 goals in his last 3 games, and I think tonight, even though I don't think his best position is that kind of right wing backy berth that O'Donnell's kind of held down quite well, he's still putting some brilliant crosses, obviously managed to get in the score sheet with a header no less, but I really do think he is one of our biggest threats going forward, and for me would be a starter. I know Christie was obviously left out tonight, and they tried Adams and Dykes together, but before we get to Adams and Dykes, I mean, Ryan Fraser surely would have to be in that starting 11 for me. Do you not think so?
Yeah, I thought he was great over the course of these 3 games. I was a wee bit concerned that his kind of lack of minutes at Newcastle would maybe kind of blunt his threat, but no, he just seems to work his socks off for Scotland. The right wing back role was an interesting one. If that's something that Clark wants to stick with going forward, that might be like a really good position for him, to be perfectly honest with you, especially if Clark wants to stick with kind of 2 big men up front in Adams and Dykes, or McBurney, or even Nisbet perhaps, I guess. So I thought he was outstanding. Just kind of echo other things you were saying as well. I thought John McGinn, we've kind of talked about it, I thought he sometimes doesn't really play too well, but he just kind of steps up with these goals. He seems like your kind of classic big game player. Shea Adams, I thought, gave a really good impression of himself. His goal against Faroe Islands was outstanding. I do wonder if McBurney was kind of hoping he could have maybe got 60 or 70 minutes against Faroe Islands to kind of break his duck, but there we go. I thought Adams has kind of proved he's probably a better player than McBurney, to be honest with you, over the course of these 3 games. But maybe don't have to pick between the two, but I think the clear and outstanding player over the course of these games is Tierney. Whether it's centre back, left wing back, left back. At one point tonight, I was thinking maybe we should even just stick him in centre midfield, to be perfectly honest with you, because we didn't really seem to have much going on there. But I thought he was outstanding there. So I thought of those 4 players kind of get pass marks for me, to be perfectly honest with you.
Yeah, so I mean, obviously some other positives there, Euan. I think Shea Adams' goal tonight was really well taken. I think just to kind of bring it back to maybe not a negative point, but I think Dykes hasn't been as effective as he was during those Nations League games, and he hasn't obviously been in great form for QPR, but I suppose the luxury we have now is we do have another striker, and you hope that maybe by the Euros Dykes might be back on it a wee bit more. But how impressed have you been with Shea Adams? I think it's just good to know we've got a striker who knows how to score, even if it was tonight just against the Faroe Islands.
Really impressed. I think along with what Stefan said. I think Kieran Tierney's been the shining light over these 3 games, and obviously John McGinn's keeps scoring goals. But the other main takeaway for me is Shea Adams, and I actually think that he should probably be our number 9 moving forward. He's just got so much to his game. He's a bigger goal threat than Dykes. He's probably quicker than Dykes. I know Dykes has been really good at kind of holding the ball up and being a kind of out ball for Scotland, but I actually think Shea Adams' link-up play is as good, if not better. And you want to be loyal to the players that kind of helps you get there, and Dykes was a big part of why Scotland are going to the Euros this summer. But if he's going to play one up top, I'd struggle to see it not being Shea Adams at the moment, because he's been really impressive and he's scoring goals. And the other thing is he's playing at the top level in England, and like you mentioned, Dykes, it hasn't been in good form in the Championship for QPR, whereas Shea Adams is scoring goals for Southampton against some decent teams as well. And it's difficult kind of looking too far ahead because you don't know what's going to happen with form or injuries. But for me, Adams is close to being a nailed on starter now, in my opinion.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, I think he took his goals so well, and as you say, I think he's actually got quite a good turn of speed again. I don't know how much that is to do with a lack of pace in the Faroes' defence, but I thought he looked pretty sharpish tonight. I guess there's just one point I was actually going to ask you, Euan, as well, and it's about the goalkeeping position. I know a few people have been maybe slightly critical of David Marshall in the Israel and Austria games. Obviously, was that kind of I think it was the first Austria goal he kind of palmed it straight into the Austrian player's path for the first goal, even though it did bounce just right in front of him. And then there's maybe an argument to say he can save that Israel goal as well. Craig Gordon came in tonight, obviously kept a clean sheet, made a great save, also had one really hairy moment. I guess what I'm saying, and again I'm asking you kind of in your Lanarkshire Live capacity here, you obviously see Liam Kelly on a regular basis. Is he someone that should be in and around the squad right now, and also with a view to the future, given that Marshall and Gordon are both getting on in years in terms of their international career?
Yeah, I thought Liam should have been the third choice goalkeeper in this squad, just because, like you mentioned, we've got 3 goalies who are all 30 plus years old, and I like John McLaughlin, think he's a safe pair of hands, a good goalkeeper, but he's not playing for Rangers. And if you're going to pick, I know it's slightly different for a goalkeeper, but if you're not going to pick players like Billy Gilmore for not playing, then it's hard to justify selecting John McLaughlin when he's not playing, especially when there's a younger goalkeeper in Liam Kelly who's been really good for Motherwell. Good goalkeeper, very good with his feet, good communicator as well. I know he had that mistake against Kilmarnock for Kyle Lafferty's goal, but the fact that he wasn't in this squad, strongly indicates that he's not going to be in the Euro squad, which I think is a shame, because you have to always kind of have one eye on the future, especially when you've got 3 goalkeepers and 2 of them, aren't going to play. In the Euros, you're going to have a number 1, and you're probably going to stick to him. And just on that, Craig Gordon's gave Clark a decision to make. I think Craig Gordon's a better goalkeeper than David Marshall, but the point is, David Marshall is now a national hero, and quite rightly so, for his heroics against Serbia. Is he undroppable?
Yeah, that's the thing. I think to an extent he is. He's like a national hero now. And again, I don't know if obviously I think it was a back injury Marshall had, so I don't know how much he's been affected by that. He's maybe not up to full speed, but I think you're spot on. He's certainly got a decision to make. I think Gordon could still have done a job at Celtic this season. I think the circumstances he left in, Celtic will be kicking themselves given what happened and given how problematic that goalkeeping position was. But I certainly think it's a tight one. And yeah, I mean, I actually really rate John McLaughlin as well, but again, we talk about players not playing. He's not been playing that much, so how much more beneficial would it be to have someone like Liam Kelly, who by all means has been a standout for Motherwell and really improved the team since arriving in January, and as we both said, a bit younger, and it just is with one eye to the future, because you don't know how much longer Marshall and Gordon both have at international level. So that's an interesting one. Well, thanks very much, Euan and Stefan. We'll be back in the next couple of days with an extra podcast as well, and there's plenty of Scotland content over on our Substack page if you've not checked out yet. Stuff on whether Andy Robertson should be dropped. Stefan also wrote a piece on just kind of generally after the Israel game how we're maybe not progressing as much as we'd like, and we've also got a piece on Stephen O'Donnell and how he's done a great job so far by James. So go and check all that out, and we will speak to you soon. Cheers.